George Lucas had a basic outline for Darth Vader's backstory before Return of the Jedi, and there are some noticeable difference between the original plan and what audiences eventually got in the Star Wars prequels. Although A New Hope is the first ever Star Wars movie, George Lucas always made sure to point out that the film was supposed to be the middle part of a much bigger story. However, it was not until 16 years after Return of the Jedi that Lucas finally got to make episodes I, II, and III. As much as George Lucas had planned the saga, some of the most important twists in the original trilogy were later additions to the story. Darth Vader was not Luke's father until one of the final drafts of The Empire Strikes Back, and that there is another line was not initially meant to refer to Leia. Still, by Return of the Jedi, Star Wars had already laid down a lot of backstory and world-building, which would be expanded with the now Legends novels and comics. Despite famous expanded universe stories like the Thrawn trilogy, the most crucial expansion of the Star Wars saga came with Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, a movie that brought the franchise back to the big screen and revealed the origins of Anakin Skywalker. However, George Lucas had already presented his ideas for Anakin's backstory 18 years earlier to producers and writers involved in Return of the Jedi. In the pitch made public by the book The Star Wars Archives, 1999 to 2005, Lucas outlines what the past of Anakin and Obi-Wan had been like, and a lot of those ideas can be found in Star Wars Episode III, Revenge of the Sith. However, there were also major differences in Anakin's story when compared to how the Star Wars prequels played out. George Lucas's original Darth Vader backstory is surprisingly close to Roth's. One similarity between George Lucas's original plans and the prequel trilogy is the idea that Anakin would grow closer to the Emperor, who at the time no one knew was bad, and thus would start to be drawn to the dark side of the Force. Lucas had also already envisioned that the Emperor would start as an elected official who would eventually acquire enough power to rule the galaxy on his own terms. Lucas's plans for Anakin also involved Padme, who at that point was described as Mrs. Skywalker, noticing that something was different with her husband, which was heavily present throughout Revenge of the Sith. The Anakin vs. Obi-Wan fight had also been outlined, including the fact that Obi-Wan was going to throw Anakin into a volcano. Not only that, but Lucas also described how the Emperor's troops were going to find what was left of Anakin, another idea that made it into Revenge of the Sith. Lucas's original Anakin plans didn't involve episodes I and II. What is curious about the revealed George Lucas plans for a Star Wars prequel story is that there is no mention of any of the events from The Phantom Menace and Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones. For example, there was nothing about Qui-Gon Jinn, Jar Jar Binks, the Trade Federation, or the events of the Clone Wars. The only villain who was name-dropped by George Lucas back then was the Emperor, with no mentions of Darth Maul, Count Dooku, or Grievous. One logical takeaway from this is that most of what George Lucas had planned for Darth Vader's origins was only enough for one movie, which adds to Revenge of the Sith being the most well-received of the prequels. Both The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones felt like they were stretching out the early years of Anakin's life, and there was still not much of Darth Vader present in the character. The Jedi Order was different in Lucas's original prequels plan, although George Lucas did not get into detail about what the Jedi were like during that time period. His description of Anakin's life suggests that there was no such thing as the prequels' Jedi Order. Instead, it seemed like the Jedi would be more like individual monks who would go on missions throughout the galaxy. That is made clear by how Obi-Wan was supposed to regret training Anakin by himself, wishing that he had sent Skywalker for Yoda to train instead. That dynamic is closer to what was seen about the Jedi in the original than it is to the prequels' Jedi Order, the latter of which had ranks for the Jedi and saw Yoda as the head of a council rather than a master who would take on different apprentices. Anakin killed the Jedi, not Order 66. One of the most interesting differences between the original plan for Anakin and what was seen in the prequels is how the Jedi were going to be killed across the galaxy. There is no mention of Star Wars' famous Order 66 plan in Lucas's outline, and, instead, it was Anakin himself who was going to kill several Jedi on different occasions. Anakin would kill Jedi, who somehow wronged him during their missions, and they would return as if nothing had happened. There would be a mystery regarding who or what was killing the Jedi, and the shocking reveal for Obi-Wan at the end is that it was Anakin. That idea also makes clear how different the Jedi were going to be in Lucas's original plans in terms of numbers. Instead of an entire army of clone troopers spread throughout the galaxy, all that would take to wipe out most of the Jedi was Anakin. Padme doesn't go to Mustafar in the original plan. Padme was only going to learn about her husband turning to the dark side after the fight between Anakin, now Darth Vader, and Obi-Wan. After realizing that the Emperor had rescued Darth Vader from the volcano, Obi-Wan would explain to Mrs. Skywalker what had happened to her husband and that it was him, Darth Vader, who was killing the Jedi across the galaxy. As such, it seems Padme was not going to play that much of a big role in Anakin's fall to the dark side, which differs a lot from how things went in Revenge of the Sith. Padme takes Leia to Alderaan, and avoids one prequel's plot hole. A direct consequence of Padme only learning about Anakin having fallen to the dark side after the final fight is that she would not die out of shock and sadness after facing a fully corrupted Anakin. Instead, Mrs. Skywalker would give birth a few months later and with no complications. Obi-Wan would then suggest that Luke and Leia had to be separated, as happened in Revenge of the Sith. However, Obi-Wan would not give Luke to Anakin's brother, Owen, and his wife, Beru, but rather to a random family in Tatooine. In addition, it was Padme herself who was going to take Leia to Alderaan. Padme would help raise Leia for a while before dying, which would have avoided one of the biggest Star Wars inconsistencies. How could Leia remember her mother when Padme died in childbirth? Eventually, George Lucas's story evolved to something different and bigger in scope, but the basic idea of Anakin's fall to the dark side had been outlined since 1981. Key release dates: Rogue Squadron release date, the 22nd of December 2023.
With a gentle touch you tell me what all love I have to share. It must be 'cause you are what I own you. Only you do know, you do know, you do know. Oh, you do know the courage. Still moving, still